Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of Truth is Justice. Well, what a week it's been. For those of you that are members of our Facebook group, you'd have an idea of what I'm referring to. For those that aren't on our Facebook page, let me try and explain what, for me, and it appears many others, has been somewhat of an eye-opening series of events. And the events of this week have made me acutely aware of the difference in perceived value of evidence based solely on the recipient's given underlying agenda. For me, these events highlight the quite extraordinary contrast between the publicly and often stated desire to achieve the truth and question the evidence, compared with the actual reality of looking the other way when it comes to perhaps more confronting evidence and solid factual findings that help us further understand the events of the evening when Jim was murdered. So, some of you must be wondering what actually happened. Well, many of you would be aware that 3 of the computers in the Melgars home, 1 desktop and 2 laptops, were taken into evidence and disk images created. Now, disk images are an exact reproduction of the contents of a hard disk or other storage device. Once they're created, the disk image allows forensic examination of those computers in a way that doesn't interfere with the original storage device in any way. Now, that forensic examination was completed by Mr. Devlin for trial, and a 66-page report based on the findings of the examination was prepared by him. Mr. Devlin provided testimony at Sandra's trial as an expert witness for the defence. Towards the end of last year, one of our members, Adam, identified some curious events listed in the forensic examination report. Amongst other things, Adam noticed that 2 of the entries, being a failed password attempt and a successful user login, were performed on one of the laptops at 11:05 and 11:39 respectively on the 22nd of December 2012. Adam raised these findings with our group at the beginning of January, and Bob was also made aware of these entries at or before that time. So you might be wondering what the importance of these entries is. Now, those entries represent one of the only solid pieces of time-specific evidence we have so far seen in this case. And prior to this, the CVS store receipt was the last solid time-specific piece of evidence we had of the timeline of events between 9:33 p.m. that evening and approximately 4:30 p.m. the following day, when Herman, Maria and their family arrived at the Melgars home. We can use various methods to arrive at an estimated time of death for Jim, but in the end, they are still approximate, not down to the minute which we have with the material in this report. Accordingly, having at least 2 events that provide us with confirmation that someone was sitting in front of a laptop during the 2-hour time frame which has been suggested that Jim was murdered is very significant. It represents the only piece of evidence that we have that gives us certainty to certain events that happened in the Melgars home that evening. So what was the controversy? Now, it seems like a crucial piece of information that would be hugely important to everyone, right? I mean, whatever view you have of the case, it would be very helpful to the timeline of events on that evening to know that at 11:05 and at 11:39 someone was interacting with the laptop. Well, it seems at least the events of this week have shown that the answer to that question is both yes and no. The information is crucially important, but not everyone wants to see it that way, and I'll explain. I put up a post on our Facebook page drawing our members' attention to the login events and pointing out that Bob was both aware of these events and had also been in touch with Sandra's defence team with respect to the events. How did I know that? Well, Bob himself noted that at the end of episode 23. Bob refers at the end of that episode to information that he obtained. He notes with respect to that information that he had sent it on to Sandra's defence team. That information is the details relating to these login events. And fantastic, right? I mean, how could that not be a great thing? Bob could then get the defence team to provide a unique insight to him into those events and what they mean for the timeline, and that can then be shared with everyone to understand the implications. What a way to progress an investigation. Get some pinpointed times that help develop a sequence of events from that night. Maybe even thoroughly review the report and see if anything else stands out. You can ask questions of the defence on the report. Lots and lots of things that you could do. As Bob often says, you could take a deep dive into and apply a magnifying glass to the evidence. Well, that would be what you think would happen in an independent, objective investigation which was truly focused on finding the truth and not just on the acquittal of Sandra. But what actually happened? Well, what happened was that my post, which sought to further this discovery by Adam, was described as a stunt by Bob. Actually, more than that. He noted that in his 3 years of podcasting, he had never seen a stunt of this type. If you're confused by that, then you're definitely not alone. It actually reminds me of a tactic I've seen often used in various areas of life. If you want to distract from a topic that is perhaps damaging to a position you have taken, you have to make an equally big statement. Now, it doesn't matter if it's factually sound or not. And you also have to aggressively attack the credibility of that statement and the person making it, and try and focus the attention elsewhere. Create a distraction of sorts. And that distraction was the attack on all the work we are doing here at Truth is Justice, and attacks on me personally. As you may have gathered, I'm not bothered at all by the attacks on me. I believe it says more about the people making those attacks than it does about me. I don't understand the attacks on Truth is Justice, though. As I've said many times before, the more eyes looking at this, the more efficiently you can reach something of a conclusion as to what exactly happened that evening. And for a lot of people, that is very important, and it's why they're attracted to what we are doing. For others, though, specifically those fully committed to Sandra's innocence, the idea of information being highlighted by us that has the impact of reducing the likelihood that Sandra is innocent represents a very real threat to them. So instead of looking at the material we present or simply just ignoring us, they attack. And again, that says more about those attacking us than it actually does about our project. So, far from being a stunt, whatever that means, because I have no idea what was being suggested, we were focused purely on the evidence, and no matter how you see it, this evidence is crucially important to understanding what happened that evening. But these tactics, employed by Bob, to some extent, had the desired effect within a very small group of his loyal followers. We saw a small group of people rushing to both attack me for, as they put it, having the nerve to raise this matter, and also attacking the actual information, suggesting that it was nothing and, in not so few words, asking people to turn away and look elsewhere because there was nothing to see in the report or in these computer entries. So if you sit back and think about it and take it in, it really does speak volumes about the motives of Bob and some of his group. I don't think it's possible anymore for it to be claimed that the cause is about justice for Jim through conducting a thorough investigation or re-investigation or an analysis of all the evidence. Of course, that is going to be the outcome when you deliberately turn away from crucial evidence that can be harmful to the convicted, especially when you are determined to find a wrongful conviction. Now let me summarise exactly what took place and why it shows that Bob's objectivity and publicly stated focus on conducting an independent, unbiased and objective investigation has been shown to have been well and truly compromised. In terms of a timeline, this is how it played out. So early January, Adam posts to our group his discovery in the report of 2 login related entries on the 22nd of December 2012 and a further DisRight event at 8:05 AM on the 23rd of December 2012. Now, this information is heavily discussed, and Bob describes that the entries in the report were absolutely nothing. He bizarrely notes that the entries reflect bots or something similar, and he goes on to talk about keystroke loggers and things, elements that aren't even discussed in the report. Now, around the 9th of January, Bob receives further information on the 2 login related entries, information that he then passes on to Sandra's defence team. On the 2nd of March, I published a post on the login entries, noting that far from being bots or keystroke loggers or anything like that, the login entries, which were a failed password attempt and a successful login, were most definitely indicative of an individual interacting with the laptop. I noted in that post that Bob would be able to provide a unique insight into this evidence from the defence perspective. Following that post, Bob responded to questions received from within his show's Facebook group, noting that he had contacted both Sandra's defence team and the digital forensic analyst who prepared the report, Mr. Devlin. Bob stated that nothing had changed, that there was nothing to see there, that he was too busy, and essentially asking for people to move along. To say that it's quite an incredible contrast to the way that Bob treats other seemingly meaningless pieces of material and evidence is a massive understatement. Remember the poster on the wall, the nature of Sandra's bindings, the Costco blouse, the Xbox serial number? All of those received large amounts of attention, but the only piece of evidence provided by a defence expert witness that provides us with a specific timeline of activities within the house on the evening when Jim was murdered, no, turn away. Nothing at all to see here. I've been asking myself a number of questions over the last week. Why wouldn't Bob be interested in finding out more about the login entries? And why would Bob be so insistent on this particular expert report by Mr. Devlin being so wholly accurate when he has so recklessly and irresponsibly attacked other expert reports and then the authors themselves? And why would Bob not share his knowledge on information relating to these login entries with his group, in the hope that they could conduct some further analysis on it? And the only answer to those questions that I can arrive at is this. The focus is Sandra's acquittal at all costs, and that means not raising or drawing attention to any information which may be negative for her and may impact on that goal. This information undoubtedly represents a significant challenge for Sandra's defence, and we will explain many of the reasons why. We are Truth is Justice, and we are setting the record straight. Now, let's take a look at the details. So what are these login entries? What's a prefetch file? And how do these times fit in with the narrative provided by Sandra and refined over and over again to fit a changing understanding of the evidence by Bob and others? A copy of the forensic examination by Mr. Devlin is available on our website under the Reports heading. I'll also place a copy in the podcast episode 14 folder, along with a copy of the transcripts of the trial testimony of Mr. Devlin. Before we get into the details of the report, I wanted to note that I have the utmost respect for Mr. Devlin. I believe he is a thorough professional and has the skills necessary to make the statements that he makes. And being an expert witness isn't an easy role. Aside from the important formalities of their training and certification, education experience and their skills, their professional reputation is perhaps their most valuable asset, and the value of it in the courtroom cannot be overstated. A blemish on the reputation of an expert witness, however small, can have a devastating impact, as it represents a way for the opposing counsel to undermine their credibility. And it is the credibility that means the most. How best to describe it? Imagine someone asking you to step up and talk about your specific job. And broadly, that's the role of the expert witness. In that context, imagine stepping up to talk about your role, knowing that someone will question you in a way potentially designed to show that your knowledge is not as thorough as what you claim, or not directly applicable to the matter being considered, and that any failure of yours in answering those questions will potentially mean your value as an expert witness has been reduced substantially in the future. The stakes are high. Now, think about the way that Bob has managed the details of these login entries. Following suggestions that the user login entries were created by an individual, as in they needed someone to actually perform them, Bob claimed that after conversations with Mr. Devlin, he can confirm that the login entries were automated, as in not performed by an individual interacting with the laptop. Now that's a massive claim to make, and one that impacts on and binds not only Bob, but far more importantly, it impacts on Mr. Devlin. and I strongly believe that it was either a misinterpretation by Bob of what Mr. Devlin said, or it was an outright lie of his when he attributed those comments to Mr. Devlin. And why am I so confident of that? Because over the last week, I've spoken with many digital forensic analysts and investigators, over a dozen of them, some of them in Houston. And what has every single one of those professionals told me? That those entries would absolutely have to have been performed by an individual interacting with the laptop, in all but the most extreme of cases. And then seeing that some will then try and latch onto those extreme cases, let's discuss them. The most extreme of cases raised by a few of the experts I spoke with is the situation where you have extremely well-funded, state-sponsored organisations that have a motivation to create software of that type. It takes enormous resources. But even if you assume that is the case in this instance, the way it was implemented simply makes no sense. Consider a state-funded group looking to, for some unknown reason, gain access to the Melgar's laptop, actually Sandra's laptop, and I'll get onto that a little bit more later. But they seek to gain access to the laptop for unknown reasons. But rather than simply gaining access through some system vulnerability, they create software that mimics a user interacting with a laptop at the login screen and then, for some entirely unknown reason, design the program to initially get the password wrong. And when that is the very thing the program is designed to do, one would rightly question the purpose. And then, possibly some 35 minutes later, the software gets the password right and it logs into the Sandy account. Now, does that sound unusual? Well, then consider if it was this Chinese or Russian-sponsored group conspiring with the dozens of others already highlighted by Bob to make Sandra look guilty. They not only designed a program with some extraordinarily unusual characteristics, including deliberately not erasing data on their login, which would have been an obvious step if they were well-resourced enough to create the software to begin with, but they did so right in the middle of the time frame given for when Jim was murdered. Now that would take not only immense technical capabilities, but also visions into the future. So in reality, and let's get back to reality, all that discussion is doing is just indulging those who will cling on desperately to any evidence that someone other than Jim or Sandra was at the laptop during the time frame when Jim was murdered. The login entries, so a successful login and the failed password attempt, were performed by a user interacting with the laptop at those specific times. Anyone suggesting otherwise is wrong, and I'll go one step further. Mr. Devlin is a professional with a significant amount of experience and training who clearly knows his stuff, and it is obvious that he put considerable time into the preparation of the report. Anyone, including Bob, that suggests that he claims those logins are anything other than a person physically interacting with the laptop at that time are either lying or they don't understand the nature of those entries and the way Mr. Devlin has expressed them. I have 100% confidence that those entries are a person interacting with the laptop at those times, not an automated process, and I'm confident that no digital forensic specialist would be willing to say otherwise. On a brief aside, let me share something interesting with you. So of the more than a dozen specialists I spoke to over the last week in relation to this report, and those that shared their views with me, 2 were happy to provide me with their views on the matter, but refused to appear on our podcast specifically because of Bob's connection with this case. They had significant concerns that a view that was accurate but went against what Bob's views are would subject them to hate campaigns and considerable negative attention directed by Bob and undertaken by his followers. And unfortunately, I had to agree with them. It's something we've seen time and time again in this case. With Ms. Barnett, with Ms. Rossi, with Mr. Carpenter, with Mr. Carazol, with Mr. Doucet, with Tom, the jury foreman. They've all experienced that level of anger and focused aggression. And it doesn't take too deep a dive into online searches to find evidence of that. So what a terrible reputation that is to have. That truly experienced and highly credentialed individuals are aware of the shocking reputation that you have in denigrating professionals, and on the basis of that don't want to interact with you. That speaks volumes in my opinion. So let's get into the details and see how it fits with the narrative and the crime scene, because there's some very interesting elements. So first, the last successful login on the Dell laptop was at 7:31 PM on the 22nd of December. Of note is that the system running on that laptop didn't require a password to log in. Remember, Jim and Sandra received the bill for their meal at Los Cucos at 8:59 PM, and they paid for their meal at 9:05 PM. and the restaurant was about a 15-minute drive from the Melgas home with clear traffic and no congestion. So we know that the laptop was being used and assume that 10 minutes after that activity, Jim and Sandra left the home. They would have arrived at Los Cucos at about 5 minutes to wait. So by the time they parked, walked into the restaurant and were seated, perhaps 8:05. So that would leave about 60 minutes to order, eat, ask for the bill and pay for the bill. And what's the relevance of that? Well, perhaps nothing. Just my thoughts that a couple that, according to Sandra, sat in a jacuzzi and talked for 2 hours about their love for each other, their plans for the future, etc., all over the noise of jets, and with Sandra's apparent hearing issues, didn't seem to be in the mood to engage in lengthy conversations at all whilst at the restaurant. A dinner that was stated by Sandra as being specifically to celebrate their 32nd wedding anniversary. The failed password entry was performed at 11:05 PM, and this was performed on the Red Gateway laptop. And remember, this is hugely significant. We know that at 11:05 PM, someone was interacting with the laptop in a way that triggered a failed password entry. Let's talk about how that failed password would play out, given what we know. Remember, the last laptop to be used was the Dell laptop, which was logged in at 7:31 PM. We don't know who used that laptop, but it was a different laptop that was open for use at 11:05 PM. That laptop, the Red Gateway, only had one user account set up on it. That account was given the name Sandy. In contrast, the HP laptop had no user accounts other than an administrator, and it was the administrator account that logged the last access to that machine at 7:31 PM on the 22nd of December. The Dell desktop had multiple user accounts. On the desktop, we have a user account for Sandy, a user account for Jim, a user account for remote access, which is named as a LogMeIn account, and an administrator account and a guest account. The Sandy account, the Jim account, and the LogMeIn account are all active. They all have logins in the days leading up to the murder. The last login for the LogMeIn account was at 8:04 PM on the 20th of December 2012. About a minute later was the last login for the Sandy account at 8:05 PM on the 20th of December 2012. And the Jim account last logged in at 5:54 PM on the 21st of December 2012. So could we say that both Jim and Sandra both used the desktop, logging in under their respective user accounts? Yes. Perhaps, that seems the most likely. Could we say that Jim used the HP laptop, logging in as the administrator user account? Yeah, perhaps. That seems very likely. And could we say that Sandra used the Gateway laptop, with the only user account being Sandy? Perhaps. I think there's a reasonably strong likelihood of that. And not for certain, of course, but Jim likely set up the computer accounts because he had the IT skills, and he deliberately set up individual Sandy and Jim accounts on the desktop and a Sandy account on the Red Gateway laptop. It would seem to fit. So back to the failed password attempt at 11:05. This would correspond to about the time that Sandra says that her and Jim were supposedly in the jacuzzi. So what has happened? The laptop's been interacted with in some way. The entering of a wrong password, the clicking of the return or the enter key, the clicking of the mouse on the OK button of the password entry box, something where a user interacted with the system. And there's something interesting to note here. The study is in direct line of sight from the jacuzzi in the master bathroom. And I'll put up a diagram that explains that on the show notes on our website. The distance between the two rooms is small. Remember, this isn't a large house. So if Sandra attempted the password and Jim was relaxing in the jacuzzi in the position that Sandra claims he would have had a direct line of sight to the entry to the study. And if Jim attempted the password entry and Sandra was relaxing in the jacuzzi in the position that she claims, she would have had a direct line of sight to the study by simply turning her head to the right in line with her shoulder. So after attempting the password and getting it wrong, and it's worth noting that we don't know whether there was only one wrong password attempt, this was just the last wrong password attempt that was logged. There could have been multiple attempts. So after entering the wrong password, it's possible that the user doesn't then interact with the laptop again until 11:39 PM, some 34 minutes later. And then that time the password entered is correct, and the user successfully logs into the user account Sandy. Now, it's also possible that following the incorrect password attempt, the account was successfully logged into, and then logged out of, only to be logged back into again at 11:39 PM. Remember, the last successful login is just that. It's the last one. It doesn't say anything about earlier logins. Again, think about the position of the study with respect to the jacuzzi. If it was Jim, Sandy just had to turn her head, and if it was Sandy, Jim had a clear view. Let's look at a few other elements relating to this successful login. And what are the possibilities for the two different logins in terms of who the user could be? It could be Jim, it could be Sandra, or to fit with the intruder theory, it could be an intruder. So would Jim use that laptop and log into the Sandy account? Who knows? Who was on the other laptop immediately prior to going out to dinner, and why? If they needed computer access again, why would they not have used that same laptop, which didn't require a password, or use the desktop? Again, who knows? Now, what else do we know? Well, thank you very much to Marie for picking this up and raising it with us. We know that Jim uses glasses. In fact, many of the photos we have of Jim, including in the one of Jim which was taken at Liz's wedding and the one of Jim at the airport when they are saying goodbye to Liz after her last visit prior to Jim's murder, they show him with glasses on. And where do we find Jim's glasses? They're placed on the bedside table beside his bed. So did Jim need glasses to use the laptop? We don't know. Did he need them to negotiate his way from the bathroom to the study without stepping on dog droppings? Again, we don't know. But it does prompt the question whether it was him that attempted the login. If it was Jim and he didn't know the password, why wouldn't he simply use the other laptop or the desktop computer? Or, as he was presumably the administrator on the Gateway laptop, just log into that as the administrator. Why potentially leave it and then wait approximately 35 minutes before trying again? Or log in again immediately after the failed password attempt, then log off, and then come back 35 minutes later and log in again. And whilst there may be, of course, scenarios where this can be made to at least fit hypothetically, I think the evidence suggests that it was very unlikely that it was Jim that logged into the Sandy account that evening at 11:39 p.m. For those that do believe that Jim was at the laptop that evening, at least the times of 11:05 and 11:39, consider how significantly that changes the time frames and the theories that have been offered up as to the sequence of events that evening. So would an intruder use that laptop? Well, I don't know. I think if you thought through it enough, you could probably come up with a situation where that is in some ways possible, albeit perhaps extremely unlikely. It would take a very significant change in the narrative from a burglary situation to an extortion type situation, and one where the intruder attempted to log in, didn't know the password, and either waited nearly 35 minutes to try it again, perhaps after interrogating Sandra for the password, or got the correct password right straight after the 11:05 failed attempt, and then for some reason logged off the machine and then logged back in some 35 minutes later. It would also take a lot of interaction centred around the study, again something that both Jim and Sandra, if they were in the jacuzzi as Sandra claims, would have had a clear view of. Sandra has no recollection of providing any passwords and makes no mention of anyone entering or exiting the study. So would Sandra have used that laptop? Well, according to her narrative, she would have been either in the jacuzzi or leaving the jacuzzi or in the master bathroom closet at that time. She makes no mention of entering the study herself that evening or seeing anyone else enter the study. It would definitely be suggested by the specific laptop used and the account logged into, being the Sandy account, that it was indeed Sandra that used the laptop. In fact, of the three possibilities, it could be argued, based on the evidence, that it was the most likely that it was Sandra that logged into her user account. Now, does that mean that Sandra murdered Jim? No, not at all. In fact, it could be argued that Sandra simply couldn't remember going into the study and logging into the laptop. Remember, the argument's often put forward that Sandra's memory of that evening was seriously impaired, whether by concussion or the effects of a seizure or the effects of post-traumatic stress or some other condition. And what does it mean if it was Sandra that was logged into the laptop? Well, at the very least, it represents a massive change in the narrative and how we understand and look at the events of that evening. So what evidence do we have to guide us as to what happened? Well, we have the crime scene photos of the study, which show an empty space on the study desk. If you look at all the photos from the study, it's quite literally one of the only spaces that isn't filled with items. There's paperwork on the ground, boxes on top of cupboards. Stuff is kept everywhere except for that space in front of the monitor on the desk. Where is the laptop that was used to log in at 11:39 p.m? Well, you can't see that laptop. And remember, it's a very noticeable red. Or you can't see the other laptop that was used up until at least 7:31 p.m. Now, it's noted in the evidence log that the two laptops were in a computer bag, along with their power chargers, and they were found in the study. So we know the laptops were not on display. We know that they were closed in a computer bag. So what does that mean? Well, that's where another entry in the report becomes important. At 8:05 a.m, there is a write to a Windows prefetch file. And what does that mean? Well, it's an indication that the system was performing a function at that time. Something triggered the system to write to that file. Not necessarily a direct user activity, but it definitely doesn't exclude a direct user activity, and it requires something to have happened to the system. The circumstances where the write to the prefetch file would absolutely not happen include if the laptop was powered off, or if the laptop was placed in hibernation or hybrid power saving mode. So we know that the laptop, after that 11:39 successful login, was not shut down, nor was it placed in hibernation mode. We know it wasn't shut down because the last complete shutdown is noted in the report as taking place about 8 days earlier. And we know it wasn't placed in hibernation or hybrid power saving modes because the prefetch file write at 8:05 a.m. the following day would not have occurred in either of those modes. So we have a laptop last logged into at 11:39 p.m. that was found closed in a computer bag that made a file write over 8 hours later, indicating that it wasn't in hibernation or hybrid mode or shut down. And what other circumstances are there? Well, maybe it was placed in the bag while still connected to power. That seems unlikely. What would be the purpose? Importantly, why would anyone, Jim or Sandra or an intruder, take the time and go to the trouble to close the laptop and put it away in a bag rather than leaving it out on the desk, which had space for it? That seems like a really unusual step to take. And remember, we've been told that the dogs at the time that the laptop was being used were supposedly in the barricaded area near the back door and or outside the house. We have some indications that the timing of the laptop use may not be consistent with the dogs not being in that study. So Tom picked up that if you zoom in closely on the dog droppings in the study, and specifically those right beside the desk near the chair, you can see what appears to be evidence that the chair was rolled over the droppings. And what would that mean? Well, assuming the laptops were used in the study, which, given that is where they were found, seems like a reasonable assumption to make, the alternative, that the laptops were used elsewhere and then taken back into the study and packed away in a bag, seems like it would create even further problems for the narrative. So either the droppings were already present in the study prior to the 7:31 or 11:05 or 11:39 laptop use, or the laptop was used at a later time when the dogs are placed in the study. It would then require the laptop user to have negotiated their way through the dog droppings and to have not been concerned at all about resting their feet directly above those droppings while seated at the chair. It seems that they had no desire to clean those droppings up, which is interesting, especially when we're told that the Melgars kept a mop and a bucket supposedly at the ready to ensure that dog droppings were able to be cleaned up quickly. So what does all of this mean? My view is that this laptop activity means an enormous amount to this case. It is crucial evidence in understanding what took place that evening. Whilst you can create different scenarios to explain it, the timeframes and the events themselves are largely beyond dispute or interpretation. They are precise timestamps on events that took place inside the Melgar home that evening. To give you a possible indication of what it means for Sandra's defence, as Adam identified, the first appeal document that was rejected due to exceeding the word limit specifically includes a reference to the information obtained during Mr. Devlin's trial in a question asked of Mr. Devlin by Mr. Seacrest, being, was there any significant user activity between 7:40 p.m. on the 22nd of December 2012 and 4 p.m. on the 23rd of December 2012? Now, interestingly, that reference did not make it into the revised appeal document. Confirmation of no user activity on the computers through the period of time from when Jim and Sandra went out for dinner and when they were discovered by Herman, Maria and family at approximately 4:30 p.m. the following day seems like crucial information. Obviously, we don't know the reasons for why it was left out. Perhaps it was felt that the words taken to communicate it were better dedicated elsewhere, or perhaps it was a deeper understanding of what those login events and the prefetch file write actually mean. Remember, the lodging of the revised appeal was at around the time when this information about the logins was being contemplated by Sandra's defence team. In wrapping this episode up, I wanted to highlight one final element that Tom identified in the case materials. On the 12th of October 2016, a court filing shows that the state were considering calling 6 digital forensic experts. Now that would potentially suggest that there was at least a consideration that the digital material contained something worthy of closer focus. As we know, the only digital forensic expert called was Mr. Devlin, and he was a defence witness. The state didn't call a single one of those 6 digital forensic experts. Remember, this filing was prior to Ms. Barnett taking on the case. It does make you wonder the reason. Was it simply a matter of all the relevant digital forensic information and considerations simply failing to be passed on to Ms. Barnett? Perhaps. One final comment. It's been repeatedly stated by Bob and others, including Liz, that all of the computers in the home were forensically analysed and that analysis confirmed that there was no evidence of motive, planning, research, or an intent to commit homicide. Of the computers tested, that is indeed what the report from Mr. Devlin states. But what isn't accurate is that every computer in the home was forensically examined. The laptop located in the southeast corner bedroom at Dell Inspiron was not one of the 3 computers forensically examined by Mr. Devlin. If you haven't already, I encourage you to continue the discussions on these matters on our Facebook page. The link is available through our website or search on Facebook for Truth is Justice. And we look forward to you joining us next week as we continue to set the record straight.
Thank you.